Welcome to another episode of the Restoration Obscura Field Guide, a podcast that unearths the forgotten corners of history and brings them back into the light. Each episode goes beyond headlines and textbook dates into the places, decisions, and moments that helped shape our world, even if they were left off the official record. These stories are built from archives, old photographs, and the physical traces still etched into the landscape. Here's your host, photographer, historian, and the creator of Restoration Obscura, John Bulmer.
Before we begin today's episode, I'm excited to announce the release of my new book, Restoration Obscura's Field Guide to the Night, Uncovering the History Hidden in Darkness. What if darkness wasn't something to fear, but something we've forgotten how to see? This book is the result of years of night photography, historical research, and long hours spent finding and exploring abandoned places. It blends memoir, history, and environmental storytelling to explore how night has shaped our cities, our culture, and our sense of self, from ancient fire rituals to Cold War radar towers, from wartime blackouts to the quiet labor of those who work while the rest of us sleep. It's not just a collection of essays, it's a guide to what remains after the lights go out and a reminder of what we stand to lose if we forget how to look. If you follow this podcast, you'll recognize the themes, the forgotten, the obscured, the histories we nearly left behind. You can find Restoration Obscura's Field Guide to the Night now on Amazon or at restorationobscurapress.com. Thanks for your support, and now let's get into today's episode. Welcome to episode 6 of the Restoration Obscura Field Guide podcast. Today, we're diving into the Cold War, how it shaped our culture, crept into our daily lives, and left a hidden legacy buried deep in the Adirondack Mountains, missiles, radar, and the quiet front lines of a war that never officially started. Before we dive in, it's important to understand that the Cold War wasn't just a geopolitical standoff. It reshaped the American landscape in quiet but lasting ways, especially here in the Northeast. Missile silos buried in farmland, radar stations perched on remote peaks, surveillance outposts hidden in dense forests. These weren't just relics, they were part of a vast, secretive network built to defend against a war that never officially began. This is the period of history I study most. My focus has long been on the Cold War and the Cold Warriors who served during its most tense moments. I've spent years digging through old satellite images and declassified files trying to piece together the systems that still leave a mark on the landscape, often overlooked, but never entirely gone. What we're exploring in this episode isn't just forgotten military history. It's the architecture of a world that once lived on the edge. What fascinates me most is the tension between how far we've come and how close we still are. The Cold War feels like history, like something buried in textbooks and fallout shelters, but its logic, its fears, its infrastructure, they're not as distant as we'd like to think. The weapons have changed, the language has changed, but the posture, the psychology, and the uneasy quiet of deterrence, that remains. So when I say the Adirondacks played a role in the Cold War, I'm not speaking metaphorically. I mean literally. You can still find it if you know where to look. The Adirondacks are remote. That's part of their myth, part of their magnetism. But beneath all that wilderness, there's something else, something buried. Not just bedrock and roots, but steel, concrete, sealed hatches, and pressure doors. Cold War ghosts sealed underground in blast-proof silence. This episode isn't about missile tests in the desert or bunkers out in the Midwest. It's about here, the Adirondacks, a place we think of as remote, peaceful, maybe even timeless. But for a few tense years in the 1960s, this wasn't a retreat, it was a front line. Missile silos, radar stations, command bunkers, they were built into these hills, designed not just to defend the country, but to survive the end of it. In Act 1, we're setting the stage, how the Cold War started, how it worked its way into everyday life, and how a quiet stretch of forest in upstate New York ended up at the center of the most dangerous standoff in human history. And let's be honest, if you grew up in the Cold War, you probably didn't learn about it in school. You learned it from movies, from The Day After, Threads, War Games, Failsafe, Dr. Strangelove. By dawn's early light, The Final Countdown, the movie where the aircraft carrier time travels back to World War II. The Hunt for Red October, Red Dawn, that one especially. It didn't just show nuclear war. It showed what came after: occupation, resistance, kids with deer rifles hiding in the woods, the world ending on VHS. Not so different from the Adirondacks. Same tree lines, same mountain terrain. Earlier than all of those, there was Gojira, the original Japanese version of Godzilla from 1954. Not the campy lizard of later films. This was black and white, grim. The monster wasn't just a monster, he was radiation-made flesh, a warning in scales and teeth. Born from hydrogen bomb testing, awakened from the deep. He tramples cities, leaves glowing footprints, and in the process, he becomes the metaphor. For Japan, he was Hiroshima and Nagasaki. For the rest of the world, he was the fear we couldn't quite name. Nuclear fire brings monsters. Some are real, some are policy. These films, they were a kind of education, a cultural download of what could happen when diplomacy failed. For a lot of us, they were the first time we realized the world could end in 30 minutes. 7 Days in May added another layer, a chilling political thriller about a military coup attempt in the United States, written during the height of Cold War paranoia. It wasn't just about nukes, it was about trust, who really holds the power, and Firefox Clint Eastwood in a stealth jet stolen from the Soviets, controlled by thought. That one gave us a look at the technological arms race. Not just bombs and missiles, but the machines that might one day think faster than humans. Cold War fear reimagined as bleeding edge espionage. And this wasn't ancient history. This was our parents' world. Some of us remember it directly. Duck and cover drills, fallout shelter signs, basements packed with canned goods and sterno heaters, public service announcements that showed evacuation maps but never told you where to go. The idea wasn't to survive, it was to die in an orderly way. So in this 3-act episode, we're looking at the Cold War where it happened here, in the Northeast, in the Adirondacks. You can find maps, photos, and declassified records at restorationobscura.com. But here in the field guide, we're going to walk through it one step at a time. Let's start with the feeling. The Cold War wasn't a traditional war. There were no front lines, no surrender, no victory parade. It was a long, slow psychological standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union. Capitalism versus communism, East versus West. Each side convinced the other might strike first. Each side building the capability to do the same. Hovering over all of it, World War II, Hiroshima, Nagasaki. The lesson that one bomb could erase a city. In 1949, the Soviets detonated their first atomic bomb. 3 years later, we responded with a hydrogen bomb. They built one the following year. The arms race was on. And it wasn't just about size. The bombs got lighter, smaller, easier to launch, easier to hide. By the end of the 1950s, both nations had enough nuclear weapons to wipe out humanity several times over. That's when we entered the era of mutually assured destruction, or MAD for short. The logic was brutal. If both sides could destroy each other, neither would risk starting a war. It was fear as policy, deterrence through total annihilation. But deterrence doesn't mean standing still. It means being ready. It means keeping bombers in the sky, submarines under the sea, missiles fueled, and waiting in silos. And that's where geography starts to matter. For most of its history, America believed its oceans made it safe. But with long-range bombers and intercontinental ballistic missiles, that illusion vanished. The shortest route from the Soviet Union to the US wasn't across the Atlantic or Pacific. It was over the Arctic, straight down from the North Pole. That made the Northeast vulnerable because of what was here: factories, cities, military hubs. General Electric in Schenectady was one of the country's top defense contractors. The Watervliet Arsenal had been building cannon barrels since the 1800s. Albany, Troy, Glens Falls, all population centers, all potential targets. And just north of all that, the Adirondack Mountains, remote, elevated, isolated, a perfect place to build what needed to be hidden or protected. And that's exactly what happened. Starting in the late 1950s, the military began building Cold War infrastructure into these hills. Plattsburgh Air Force Base expanded. The Strategic Air Command moved in. and nearby 12 Atlas F missile silos were constructed, 10 in New York, 2 in Vermont, all part of the 556th Strategic Missile Squadron. The Atlas F was America's first operational intercontinental ballistic missile. It carried a 3.75 megaton warhead, about 250 times the size of Hiroshima, and could fly over 6,000 miles. Each missile was stored vertically underground in a hardened silo. When launched, it would be fueled, lifted on a hydraulic elevator, and fired all within about 15 minutes. But the missile sites were just one layer. This region was also part of a broader air defense network. The most famous of these was the DEW Line, the Distant Early Warning Line, a chain of radar stations stretching across the Arctic from Alaska through northern Canada to Greenland. It was designed to detect incoming Soviet bombers flying over the North Pole before they reached the continental United States. The DEW Line wasn't in the Adirondacks, it was thousands of miles north, but it set the framework for an entire web of detection systems that extended into the lower 48. What we had here was part of the next layer down, a series of radar installations feeding data into the SAGE system's semi-automatic ground environment. A Cold War era computer network designed to process radar data and coordinate a rapid military response. In New York, that meant command centers, backup systems, and smaller radar sites, including gap filler radars scattered through rural areas, including the outskirts of the Adirondacks. Some of these sites were staffed, others were fully automated. Their job was to catch anything that slipped through, to plug the holes. Blips on a screen scanned by technicians who knew that any one of them could be the start of World War III. If something showed up on radar, alarms would sound, DEFCON levels would rise, bombers would scramble, silos would prep. The whole system was engineered to respond in minutes, not hours, because that's all we'd have. For the people living near these places, the experience was strange. One day the woods were just woods. Next there were trucks, fences, concrete poured at 2 a.m, and then silence again. Like something important had been buried. And that leads us to the uncomfortable question, what would have happened if the war had actually turned hot? If Act 1 was about the feeling, the atmosphere, the fear, the scale, Act 2 is about the machinery, the people, the places, the infrastructure that turned these mountains into a launch platform. Because the Cold War didn't just cast a shadow over the Adirondacks, it bored straight down into them. And at the center of that ring was Plattsburgh. Plattsburgh Air Force Base didn't begin with the Cold War. Its military roots go back to the War of 1812, with troops stationed on the western shore of Lake Champlain. But it wasn't until the 1950s, with the rise of the Strategic Air Command, that the sleepy post became a cornerstone of American nuclear defense. In 1954, the base underwent a major expansion. New runways, new hangars, new tenants, B-47 Stratojets, KC-97 tankers. Then came the big ones, B-52 Strato Fortresses, KC-135 Stratotankers, giant planes with continental range and apocalyptic payloads. Plattsburgh became a bomber and refueling hub, a strategic spoke in the wheel of deterrence. The runway, one of the longest east of the Mississippi, built to accommodate the biggest bombers America had, and heavy enough to bear the weight of Cold War doctrine. But it wasn't just about planes. The bombers needed backup, a second punch, a second chance. That's where the missiles came in. The SM-65 F Atlas, known as Atlas F, was the first operational intercontinental ballistic missile deployed by the United States. Liquid-fueled, 2-stage, capable of flying over 6,000 miles and delivering a single 3.75 megaton warhead. That's about 250 times the power of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Each missile was stored vertically underground in a reinforced silo made of concrete and steel. Upon launch command, the missile was raised to the surface on a hydraulic elevator fueled with volatile liquid oxygen and fired. The launch sequence took about 15 minutes from start to ignition, 15 minutes to cross a threshold humanity could never return from. Handling these weapons required precision and nerve. The Atlas wasn't a plug-and-play system. The fueling process was dangerous. The missile itself was temperamental. Crews trained constantly, drills, simulations, maintenance routines. But behind every checklist lurked the unspoken question: would it actually work when it mattered? The 556th Strategic Missile Squadron, activated in 1961, operated the Atlas F silos around Plattsburgh. Their motto: vigilance and strength. It's worth pausing here. The Atlas F missile sites surrounding Plattsburgh weren't just another line item in America's Cold War arsenal. They were the only operational intercontinental ballistic missile silos ever deployed east of the Mississippi River. That fact alone sets this region apart. But their mission went even further. These sites weren't just defending upstate New York. They were tasked with shielding the entire eastern seaboard. From Washington, D.C. to Boston, the Atlas Ring stood ready as a nuclear backstop for some of the most densely populated and strategically vital areas in the United States. 12 sites formed an invisible ring of readiness, 10 scattered across upstate New York, 2 just across the Vermont border. Together, they created a hardened, redundant defensive perimeter. You might drive past them today without knowing. A gravel road, a rusted fence, a cluster of odd mounds. But if you follow that road, if you cross that fence, you find Cold War architecture embedded in the earth. Ellenburg, Champlain, Willsboro, Lewis, Redford, Swanton. Take Lewis, for example. From the roadside, it looked like an access road to a gravel pit. Follow it far enough and you'd reach the fence, chain link topped with barbed wire. Inside was the surface facility, concrete outbuildings, blast doors, vent stacks, unassuming but deadly. Beneath that structure, the silo, 180 feet deep, wide enough to house the missile, the support infrastructure, and the crew. The silo complex had multiple chambers, launch control, power generation, fuel storage, connected by tunnels, reinforced against blast shock. Crews didn't live there. They rotated in for 24-hour shifts, 4 people at a time. Once sealed inside, the outside world might as well have been on another planet. The surface was locked. Communications were one way. They waited, they ran drills, they checked gauges, they read technical manuals, played cards, killed time. But every one of them knew that if the call ever came, there'd be no more drills. The launch protocol was simple and impossible. 2 keys turned simultaneously by 2 different crew members 10 feet apart. No one person could launch a missile alone. The keys weren't symbolic. They completed the circuit. The act of turning them, it was ignition. And in that moment, everything they had trained for, years of monotony, stress, and secrecy, would come down to a second. But what if that moment had arrived? Let's say it's 2:16 a.m., Site 6 in Ellenburg. The crew is midway through a maintenance checklist. Then the klaxon sounds, not a drill. The alert tone they've trained for but never heard. They race to stations, authenticate the order, confirm targeting data. Every second matters. At Site 8 in Swanton, Vermont, the launch crew initiates procedures. The missile elevator groans to life, lifting the warhead into position. And then impact. A Soviet ICBM detonates in the airspace above Swanton. A high-altitude burst. The blast hits 6 seconds later. The open silo doors are blown off. The missile never launches. Instead, it ruptures. The warhead is destroyed in place. Shockwaves fracture bedrock. The silo floods. Groundwater rushes in. In the towns below, Middlebury, Ticonderoga, Willsboro, ash falls with the snow. The sky goes white. The air smells like copper. In Plattsburgh, families shelter in basements. Emergency radio cuts in and out. Streetlights flicker, then die. Somewhere, a siren keeps sounding longer than it should, and it all unfolds before a single U.S. missile clears its silo. Because the Atlas system, while groundbreaking, was slow, exposed, vulnerable. It was designed to work, but only if it had time. The fueling process couldn't be rushed. The elevator lift wasn't instant. The silo doors were heavy, the electronics temperamental. The Atlas was a prototype, a working one, but a first draft. It taught the U.S. how to build nuclear deterrents, but it also showed how quickly they could become outdated. By 1965, the Atlas program was obsolete. Solid fuel missiles like the Minuteman could launch directly from underground without the delay, without the risk. The 556th was decommissioned. The silos were sealed. Some flooded, some were auctioned off. A few were picked up by doomsday preppers, eccentric millionaires. But many of the men who served, they carried the silence with them. They trained to end the world and never had to. And when they left the service, they returned to lives that didn't quite match the intensity of what they'd prepared for. Some didn't talk about it at all. You spend your youth memorizing fail-safes and kill switches, but after it's over, you mow the lawn or go shopping for groceries. The differences in realities were surreal for many. A few sites got creative reuse. One in Saranac was converted into a Cold War museum. Another became a wine cellar. One man built a 3-level bunker home with a hydroponic farm and a satellite internet connection. On the surface, it still looks like ruins. Others sit sealed, some flooded. In Champlain, vent stacks poke through the brush, the only clues marking buried secrets. In the next act, we head deeper into the mountains, to the radar stations, the surveillance grid, the people who watch the skies, waiting for a war that never came. Act 3 begins in October of 1962. The world stood on the edge. In Cuba, Soviet missile crews worked in secret, racing to install nuclear weapons just 90 miles off the Florida coast. In Washington, military leaders debated invasion. And in the Adirondacks, a quiet panic unfolded. This time, it wasn't theoretical. The scenario we imagined in the last act, sirens sounding, silos opening, warheads rising into the North Country air, was nearly real. This time, it wasn't a drill. It was DEFCON 2. The closest America had ever come to nuclear war. Atlas missiles across upstate New York were rushed to full alert status. Crews in places like Swanton, Ellenburg, and Lewis were ordered to prepare for immediate launch. Warheads were installed. Blast doors sealed. Security tightened. The missile systems, vulnerable and slow though they were, stood ready. At Plattsburgh Air Force Base, bombers were loaded, crews stationed, tankers idled on the runways ready to refuel jets bound for Soviet targets if diplomacy failed. Fighter jets skimmed low over Lake Champlain on constant patrol. The base bristled with motion like a hive under stress. Local residents didn't have all the facts, but they felt the shift. More trucks, more helicopters, a sharpness. Men stationed at the silos later recalled being told to stay underground and await further orders. One airman stationed in Ellenburg remembered the silence vividly. You didn't talk about it. You just did what you were trained to do, and you hoped you wouldn't be the one who had to turn the key. Until that point, the Cold War had existed mostly in abstraction. Missiles on charts, policies in binders, warheads in bunkers. But for a few days in October 1962, it became personal, existential. Towns like Plattsburgh, Saranac, and Ticonderoga were no longer remote. They were targets, and everyone knew it. Then as suddenly as it had escalated, it was over. The Soviets agreed to withdraw their missiles from Cuba. The U.S. made quiet concessions in Turkey, and the world exhaled reluctantly. But for the crews of the 556th Strategic Missile Squadron, things would never quite go back to normal. The crisis had shown how narrow the margin truly was, how fragile the system, and how close we had come. Within 3 years, the Atlas program was done. Project Added efforts began phasing out the missile sites by 1965. The technology had aged fast. The 15-minute launch window, the volatile liquid oxygen, the exposed surface infrastructure, each a liability in the age of solid fuel missiles like the Minuteman. These newer missiles could be fired directly from underground, instantly with less risk and greater reliability. The 556th was decommissioned. The missiles dismantled or shipped to Cape Canaveral for use as space launch vehicles. The Cold War had moved on, faster, smarter, deeper underground. But in upstate New York, it left things behind. The silos didn't vanish, they just became quieter. Across Clinton, Essex, and Franklin counties, the remnants of the Atlas era remain embedded in the earth. Some silos flooded naturally over time, becoming vertical lakes. Others were sealed with concrete, lost beneath forest regrowth and overgrown access roads. But a few were sold off, and that's where the story turned surreal. There were missile silos scattered across the country, dozens in New York, others in Kansas, Nebraska, the Dakotas, Colorado, Texas. Some were abandoned, others sealed, and a few got new lives. One was converted into a private home complete with climate control, Wi-Fi, a garage, and solar panels. Another became a luxury Airbnb. Missile Bay turned living room, original blast doors still in place. Guests sipped cocktails beneath rusted conduit, wondering what the red button once did. Others were turned into data bunkers, server farms, even survival condos marketed to the ultra-wealthy, complete with movie theaters, spas, and shooting ranges. But not all stories of reuse are whimsical. Some sites carry scars that never healed. The solvents used to clean missile parts, chiefly trichloroethylene or TCE, leached into groundwater at numerous launch sites, contaminated private wells. In the 1990s, towns like Champlain and Redford in New York began to raise the alarm. But they weren't alone. Similar stories played out in Arizona, in Missouri, in parts of California and Colorado. Residents reported illnesses, lawsuits followed, and in some places, warnings still remain posted. Do not drink well water. The EPA and state agencies have mapped out cleanup zones, monitored plume migration, and installed filtration systems. But remediation is slow. The problem, like the silos, runs deep. These are the quieter legacies of Cold War defense, the ones that don't end when the missile is dismantled or when the launch crews go home, the ones buried in basements and water tables, the ones still echoing underground. But let's return to that week in 1962 and imagine just for a moment if history had broken differently. October 27th, a Soviet submarine cornered near Cuba. Crew, exhausted and under pressure, launches a nuclear torpedo. Washington responds. The missiles in upstate New York go hot. Plattsburgh Air Force Base is struck by a Soviet warhead. The blast vaporizes the airfield and ignites a firestorm over Lake Champlain. The lake boils. Fallout settles over Burlington. At the same moment, a second missile hits the Atlas site near Lewis. The silo erupts. The warhead inside is destroyed. Shockwaves tear through the Adirondack rock. The forests burn from within. General Electric in Schenectady is next. A warhead flattens the industrial hub of the Mohawk Valley. Radiation spreads toward Albany, Troy, and Pittsfield. The Hudson becomes a contaminated vein. The national response buckles. Communications fail. Power grids collapse. The interstates clog with panicked traffic and overturned vehicles. And in the space of a single morning, upstate New York becomes a dead zone. Towns rendered invisible under a white radioactive haze. But that's not what happened. Instead, the silos remain quiet, unlaunched. Their doors rusted shut, their control rooms hollow. Grass grows over their vents. Salamanders climb the ladders where crews once stood, waiting for a launch order that never came. These places were built to end the world. Now they're mostly forgotten, but the story didn't stop there. Because even though the Atlas sites were deactivated, the logic that created them still shapes our world. The Cold War never truly ended. It mutated. Today's nuclear posture lives in mobile launchers, stealth bombers, hypersonic delivery systems, and drone swarms. It lives in diplomatic red lines and flashpoints. Ukraine, the Taiwan Strait, the South China Sea. The weapons are faster now, more precise, less forgiving. We live in an age of multiple apocalypses, where AI is being trained to predict nuclear escalation, where deepfakes can sow confusion faster than official warnings can be issued, where climate disasters and cyber attacks threaten stability before missiles ever leave the ground. And yet the old anxiety returns, that suspicion when the power flickers during the news, that moment when a siren test feels too long. We've lived with the unthinkable before, and we're doing it again. The Cold War's deepest legacy isn't just in the weapons, it's in our psychology, our policies, our art, our expectations of normal. It's in the movies we watch, the metaphors we use. This episode began with a story about missiles buried in the mountains, but it's really about what they left behind. Tension that shaped a generation and shadows the next. And maybe most of all, it's about proximity to the brink. Because the truth is, we were closer than we want to remember. And we may be closer now than we're willing to admit. You know, we have this habit, humans do, of circling back to the same fears, the same tensions, just dressed a little differently. When you look at today's world through the lens of the Cold War, it's hard not to notice the similarities. The names have changed. The technology's more advanced, but the anxiety, the posturing, it's all still there. As one observer put it, history never truly ends, it just changes its uniform. And maybe that's the lesson worth carrying forward. Thanks for taking this journey back to the Cold War with me. Epilogue. I recorded this episode in May 2025 before the world shifted again on June 21st. That's the date the United States confirmed strikes on targets in Iran, described as linked to the country's nuclear program. While officials claimed the operation was limited and precise, its symbolism was unmistakable. Nuclear infrastructure has once again become a live target. The long-standing taboo surrounding preemptive action on nuclear-related sites, established after decades of Cold War deterrence, was crossed with a calculated message. Its geopolitical implications are still developing as nations weigh the precedent and recalibrate their red lines. For many, it felt like a return to a darker kind of logic. Iran's nuclear ambitions have been a point of global tension for years, but this strike marked an escalation. It happened amid a backdrop of rising regional conflict, proxy warfare, cyber attacks, and diplomatic breakdowns. And it comes as arms control frameworks erode, with key treaties abandoned or ignored, and new technologies racing ahead of regulation. When I first explored the remains of Cold War installations in the Adirondacks, I thought I was documenting a closed chapter, a long moment of dread, strategy, and restraint that we'd learned from, if never fully escaped. But what happened on June 21st reminds us that the Cold War's infrastructure may be corroding, but its thinking still holds. The facilities built in the North Country were part of a vast apparatus meant to watch the sky. They were staffed by men and women who trained for a war they prayed would never happen. That war didn't come, but the systems remained. Now, decades later, we're watching a new generation confront old questions under new pressures. What constitutes a provocation? Where's the threshold? Who decides when a warning becomes a weapon? This episode was meant to reflect on the past, but history doesn't recede. It waits in bunkers, in policy, in the silence before a strike. We are once again living in a moment where vigilance isn't just memory, it's a necessity. What lies buried in the Adirondacks and in the decisions made under pressure today should remind us how quickly the world can shift and how easily yesterday's ruins become tomorrow's warnings. Thanks for listening, and stay with me for bonus content at the end of this episode of the Field Guide. Before we wrap, I want to take a moment to talk about the stories that helped shape my understanding of the Cold War. Not the ones found in government reports or technical manuals, but the ones told through film and fiction. Because if you really want to understand how people lived under the shadow of global annihilation, you have to look at what they imagined, what they feared, and what they created. For me, it started early. 7 Days in May was probably the first film that made me realize the Cold War wasn't just about bombs. It was about trust, about what happens when the real danger comes from within. Then came On the Beach, a slow, quiet burn that shows the world ending as radiation drifts across oceans and people wait out the inevitable. And there was Red Dawn. Say what you want about the fantasy of high schoolers with AKs fighting Soviet paratroopers. It captured something primal, the fear of invasion, the fear that war wouldn't be distant but sudden and right outside your door. That idea stuck with a generation. Some stories went even deeper into paranoia. Firefox, for example, Eastwood stealing a Soviet jet by thinking in Russian, or The Final Countdown, where an aircraft carrier slips through time to the day before Pearl Harbor, forcing a question that still resonates. If you had the power to change the past, would you? Should you? Submarine films like The Hunt for Red October and Crimson Tide played on the tension of silence. Two men, one set of codes. The weight of the world hovering between interpretation and instinct. The Day After was the opposite, loud, brutal, and unforgettable. It didn't leave you with hope. It left you staring at the ceiling. It left Reagan pacing the White House afterward, wondering if we'd gone too far. Then there's Threads. I don't even know what to say about Threads, except that once you see it, you can't unsee it. It doesn't dramatize the apocalypse. It reports it, bleak, relentless, real. And by dawn's early light, that one hit different. A miscommunication, a rogue launch, a chain of retaliatory options no one can stop. It's not a war movie. It's a systems failure movie. It shows how once the wheels are in motion, no one, not the president, not the generals, can fully control what comes next. And that's what always scared me the most. Then there's War Games, the one that probably reached the most people and scared them in the right way. A teenager hacks into a military supercomputer thinking he's playing a game. He nearly starts World War III. And the lesson it leaves behind is one we're still grappling with, that the more we automate war, the less human it becomes, and the easier it is to forget what it really means. And the Manhattan Project from 1986. That one gets overlooked, but it's just as important. A high school kid builds a working nuclear bomb to prove how easy it's become. It's a Cold War story told through science fair rebellion. And what it shows is chilling, that the line between knowledge and destruction is paper thin, that even good intentions can spiral once the genie is out of the bottle. And through it all, Dr. Strangelove reminded us that absurdity might be the most honest lens of all. That maybe the scariest part of nuclear war wasn't the science. It was the people making the decisions, the generals, the egos, the systems built with no off switch. But it wasn't just movies, it was books too. Alas, Babylon showed us how quickly the modern world could vanish and how communities might try to rebuild. Failsafe made the systems fail in just the right way. Trinity's Child brought emotion to a post-strike world where command decisions mattered more than survival. And the Bedford incident reminded us that escalation doesn't need intention, just momentum. These stories weren't escapism, they were warnings dressed as drama. They gave us characters to follow when headlines became too big to understand. And for me, as a student of this era, they weren't just background noise, they were signals. Clues to how the Cold War shaped not just geopolitics, but imagination. They taught us that the greatest threat wasn't just a missile on a screen, but the choices we make in fear, in silence, and sometimes by accident. And if you really want to understand the Cold War, not just what happened, but how it felt, you do well to revisit these places, these stories, these themes, because the infrastructure may be buried, the names may have changed, but the tension, the legacy, that part never really left. Thanks for listening to another episode of The Field Guide. If you've been enjoying the Restoration Obscura Field Guide, our deep dives into forgotten history, lost infrastructure, and the legends of the past, there's a way to be part of the story behind the scenes. We're currently welcoming select sponsorship partners for upcoming episodes and articles. Whether you're an independent brand, museum, publisher, archive, or just someone who believes in the power of storytelling, this is your chance to reach an engaged, history-loving audience across Substack, Facebook, Instagram, and all major streaming platforms. If your mission aligns with ours, preserving the past, exploring the overlooked, or just digging deeper than the headlines, we'd love to connect. For sponsor opportunities and media inquiries, contact restorationobscura@gmail.com. Let's bring more forgotten stories to light together. You've been listening to the Restoration Obscura Field Guide podcast, a show about overlooked places, buried histories, and the ways the past still shapes the world around us. You can find this show on all major streaming platforms. Please take a moment to like, rate, and subscribe. It helps more listeners discover these stories. If you'd like to support this work and get access to original articles, photographs, and behind-the-scenes research, visit restorationobscura.substack.com. Your support keeps the archive alive. This podcast is copyright 2025 Restoration Obscura and John Bulmer Media, all rights reserved. No part of this podcast may be reproduced, distributed, or transmitted in any form without prior written permission, except for brief quotations and reviews or academic work. Thanks for listening. I'm John Bulmer. And remember, every photo has a story, and every story connects us. Until next time, take care.
This was a Restoration Obscura broadcast. Archive reference terminated. Operation complete. Restoration Obscura signing off.